Britain likely had the most powerful navy in the world prior to the outbreak of World War II, but many figures give a false impression of their strength relative to the United States Navy. The Royal Navy certainly had a clear advantage in numbers, but most of these were smaller craft, not major surface combatants. This video will focus on comparing the United States and Britain's major surface combatants, as well as the two nations' carrier forces. The Royal Navy was an early adopter of carrier aviation, but by 1939, the United States had a clear superiority in carrier forces. The United States had the two massive converted battlecruisers Lexington and Saratoga. Each of these ships was capable of carrying up to around 90 aircraft in various states of readiness. Being converted from battlecruiser hulls, these aircraft carriers were relatively fast and able to make speeds of over 30 knots. The two Yorktown-class aircraft carriers, USS Yorktown and USS Enterprise, carried a similar number of aircraft to the Lexingtons, but they seemed to be even more capable of surviving damage than their converted battlecruiser cousins. The two carriers were relatively easy to patch together as well, even after crippling battle damage. A great example of the ship's survivability is when the Enterprise had its forward elevator blown off and continued to conduct launch operations during the Guadalcanal campaign. Another prime example is when the Yorktown was heavily damaged at the Battle of Coral Sea, but was able to be patched back together in 3 days to be ready for the Battle of Midway. During the Battle of Midway, the USS Yorktown took quite a beating, to the point where the Japanese had actually thought they had sunk multiple U.S. aircraft carriers, when really they had just been targeting the Yorktown. Unfortunately, the Yorktown was sunk by a Japanese submarine while being towed away from the battle. The last U.S. carrier on this list, the USS Ranger, was not as good as the Yorktowns or the Lexingtons. It didn't have any room for stowing torpedoes originally, and it didn't have the survivability needed for carrier actions. Still, it was very capable of escorting ships or supporting land invasions once control of the sea had been achieved. Compared to most British carriers, it had a far larger air wing of between 70 to 80 aircraft. In total, counting reserve aircraft, the U.S. carrier fleet could bring roughly 430 aircraft to a carrier battle if all of its forces were massed. The Royal Navy's carriers were of a far lower quality than their American counterparts. The British had the Argus, a glacially slow aircraft carrier with a top speed of only around 20 knots. Realistically, it was only capable of being used to train pilots, escort convoys, or deliver airplanes to far-off territories. The HMS Hermes had a slightly higher top speed of around 25 knots. Still, it only carried 20 aircraft and was generally only effective for escort duties. The carrier HMS Eagle was converted from a battleship hull, which meant it could only reach a top speed of around 24 knots. It was also only capable of carrying around 25 to 30 aircraft. The Royal Navy did have some passable aircraft carriers. The Glorious, Courageous, and Furious, which were originally built as a class of large light cruisers, were great candidates for conversion into aircraft carriers. They were actually far more capable as aircraft carriers than they were as large light cruisers. The Courageous class were capable of making around 30 knots, which automatically makes them more capable than the Argus, Hermes, and Eagle. They still only carried around 36 aircraft each, but they were far more capable overall than most other British carriers. The Ark Royal was the only Royal Navy carrier that really stacked up against its American counterparts. It had a decent top speed, like the Courageous class, but could, in theory, carry about twice as many aircraft. If the Royal Navy massed all of their fleet carriers, they could bring somewhere around 240 aircraft into battle. So the U.S. Navy had a massive carrier force advantage. In terms of naval aircraft, the British were also generally outclassed, though this is not the subject of this video. And now on to battleships. The Royal Navy had 5 Queen Elizabeth-class battleships. Each was armed with a main battery of 8 15-inch guns and was able to make a top speed of around 24 knots. Though these ships were relatively old, some were refitted during the interwar period, and as a whole, the class was quite successful through World War II. The Royal Navy also had 5 Revenge-class battleships, which were essentially bargain bin Queen Elizabeths. They were a bit smaller and a bit slower, but they were still quite capable, though their top speed of only 21 knots was limiting. The Nelson and the Rodney were the best battleships that the Royal Navy had in 1939. They were both extremely capable. Each was armed with a main battery of 9 16-inch guns. They had the heaviest broadside out of all of the ships available to either nation. They also had a respectable top speed of around 25 knots if they really stressed out their propulsion system. Lastly, the Royal Navy had the old battleship Iron Duke, and most importantly, the 3 battlecruisers Hood, Renown, and Repulse. All 3 of these ships were capable of making over 30 knots. The Hood was armed with 8 15-inch guns, and the Renown and the Repulse were armed with 6 15-inch guns each. The United States had the Arkansas and Wyoming, which were old, slow battleships capable of a speed of only 20.5 knots. They were armed with a main battery of 12 12-inch guns. Their broadside weight was about that of the Queen Elizabeth's. The New York and Texas were similarly slow and were armed with a main battery of 10 14-inch guns, with a broadside weight roughly equivalent to the Queen Elizabeth class. Continuing the pattern of 10 14-inch guns and a 20.5 knot top speed, the Nevada and Oklahoma were very similar warships, just with a much more efficient layout. The Pennsylvania and the Arizona were slightly faster, with a top speed of around 21 knots. They were armed with 12 14-inch guns. The New Mexico, the Mississippi, and the Idaho were essentially modified versions of the Pennsylvania and the Arizona. They had a similar main armament and a similar top speed. The Tennessee and the California had a similar top speed and armament, but they represented a significant step in terms of survivability. It should be noted that the 14-inch guns on the New Mexicos, the Tennessee, and the California were actually larger, more powerful 50 caliber guns compared to the Arizona and the Pennsylvania's 45 caliber guns. And lastly, the Colorado, Maryland, and West Virginia were almost identical to the Tennessees, but they had a main armament of 8 16-inch guns instead of 12 14-inch guns. The U.S. battle line had a significant advantage in broadside weight over the Royal Navy battle line, but the U.S. battleships were significantly slower than many of their Royal Navy counterparts. The Revenge class had a top speed similar to that of most U.S. battleships, and it could prove to be a limiting factor if they were included in Royal Navy formations during a major battle. Though each navy had its own advantages in certain areas, overall the 2 battle lines were likely relatively close in strength. Though the Royal Navy certainly had the largest fleet in the world in 1939, the United States Navy had already caught up or surpassed the Royal Navy in many ways. Though Britain had a distinct cruiser advantage, the U.S. arguably had a stronger battle line, and the U.S. had clearly superior carrier forces. Well, thanks for making it to the end of the video. I hope y'all have a great day. Godspeed.